If you look closely at the global systems that govern our lives,
Hmm.
the flow of capital, the enforcement of borders, or even just the invisible architecture of the internet, you eventually realize something kind of terrifying,
Oh, absolutely.
right? Like you realize that all of it, every single massive geopolitical pivot rests on this incredibly fragile physical foundation.
Yeah, a foundation that most people don't even think about until it cracks.
Exactly. And so today, we are opening up a highly curated stack of sources from The Economist, dated July 11th, 2026. Our mission for this deep dive into the sources is to look at a region, specifically Asia, that is redefining itself at a speed that, honestly, it kind of defies historical precedent.
It really does. I mean, we are looking at this massive collision between hyper-advanced technological ambitions, these enormous geopolitical tugs of war, and at the absolute center of it all, a deeply human search for meaning.
Yeah, a search for meaning and self-improvement amidst total chaos.
It is a profound intersection because, we're moving way past the era where we could analyze economics, military strategy, and cultural shifts in these neat little separate silos
Right, they bleed into each other now.
completely.
Yeah.
The sources today show us how a diplomatic spat over a microchip in the Netherlands is directly connected to the domestic anxiety of a young student in South Korea.
Yeah.
The world is just so tightly bound right now, and the friction points are really heating up.
They are. But before we get into the actual mechanics of that friction, I do need to give a quick but super important note to you, our listener.
Yes, definitely worth stating up front.
Right. So the sources we are unpacking today, they deal heavily with differing and often totally opposing political systems. We are going to be discussing the strategies of Western liberal democracies right alongside the strategies of China's one-party system.
Hmm.
And our objective here is strictly analytical. We are just imparting the facts, the strategies, and the viewpoints exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Right, we are not here to endorse any political side or ideology.
Exactly. We are here to strip the emotion out of the rhetoric and simply unpack the underlying ideas and maneuvers. We aren't taking sides.
Which really is the only way to genuinely understand the why behind these global shifts. I mean, if we just react to the headlines, we totally miss the underlying architecture of the strategies being deployed.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the absolute bleeding edge of the geopolitical chessboard, which, ironically, is completely microscopic.
Right, the world of semiconductors.
Yeah. The sources make it clear that whoever controls the semiconductor supply chain basically dictates the macro balance of global power. And that brings us to the epicenter of the silicon universe, which is ASML.
The Dutch giant.
Right, this Dutch company that manufactures extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines. And just to be clear, these are the only machines on the planet capable of printing the ultra-advanced chips required to train frontier AI models.
They hold a total monopoly on this specific technology.
But the Trump administration, specifically U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, has thrown this massive wrench into the works. Lutnick is alleging that one of these highly restricted EUV machines has somehow been smuggled into China.
Yeah, and ASML is pushing back on that with a categorical, heavily documented denial. I mean, they are not messing around with this response.
What are they saying exactly?
Well, they've explicitly informed American officials that they are tracking the exact pinpoint location of every single one of the 340 EUV machines they have ever produced.
All 340 of them.
Every single one, including 26 older models that have been entirely decommissioned. They are stating on the record that 0 machines are in Chinese territory.
See, I look at Litnick's allegation and I genuinely struggle with the physical logistics of it. We are not talking about smuggling a laptop or even like a car in a shipping container.
No, not at all. An EUV machine is the size of a city bus.
Exactly. It requires a literal fleet of Boeing 747s just to transport the disassembled components. How do you hide a machine the size of a bus that requires constant online monitoring?
You really can't.
It's like stealing the Eiffel Tower and hoping no one notices it in your backyard. Plus, beyond the physical size, the idea of secretly operating one seems technically impossible.
Right, completely impossible. Smuggling an EUV isn't about hiding a big box. The machine requires a constant umbilical connection to ASML's software network back in Veldhoven.
Just to keep it running.
Yeah, just to calibrate the lasers and maintain the vacuum environment. Without that live telemetry, the whole thing is effectively a $200 million paperweight.
So, okay, If the logistics makes smuggling an entire operational machine virtually impossible, what is actually driving the Commerce Secretary's paranoia here?
What's fascinating here is that the focus on a quote-unquote stolen machine might actually be a deliberate political red herring.
A distraction.
Exactly. The underlying panic in Washington isn't really about a midnight heist of a bus-sized laser. It is rooted in the fact that China's domestic technological progress is severely outpacing Western projections.
Okay, so if it's not a whole machine, what are the alternate theories in the sources?
When you bypass the political rhetoric and look at what industry experts are saying in these sources, the vulnerability isn't whole machines, it's components.
Like spare parts.
Right. Critical lenses, highly specialized mirrors, or specific sensors that might be finding their way into Shenzhen through these incredibly obfuscated third-party supplier networks.
Ah, I see. But I argue it goes even deeper than smuggled parts. Because the sources indicate the real headache for the U.S. stems from older technology that is already legally inside China.
Yes, the DUV machines.
Exactly. Deep ultraviolet lithography. ASML still sells a massive amount of these older, slightly less restricted machines to Chinese firms. In fact, DUV-related sales accounted for roughly a third of ASML's entire revenue in 2025.
And that is the critical vulnerability. Because Chinese chip makers, specifically SMIC and Huawei, they haven't just, accepted the limitations of that older DUV technology.
No, they've hacked it, essentially.
They have. They've weaponized this highly complex engineering technique called multi-patterning.
Okay, I want to break down the mechanics of multi-patterning for a second because it perfectly illustrates the difference between normal economic logic and state-sponsored strategic logic.
Yeah, it really does.
So normally, an EUV machine prints the incredibly fine pathways of a cutting-edge chip in a single clean exposure. But a DUV machine uses a wider wavelength of light, so it physically cannot print a line that thin, right?
Right, the brush is too thick, basically.
Exactly. But SMIC figured out that if you run the silicon wafer through the DUV machine multiple times using slightly offset masks, basically overlapping the broader exposures over and over, you can eventually carve out logic chips that are smaller than 7 nanometers.
Which puts them squarely in the territory that the U.S. export controls were specifically designed to prevent them from reaching.
It's a massive loophole.
It is. Now, to your point about economic logic, multi-patterning is commercially insane.
Because of the error rate?
Yes. Running a wafer through a machine 3 or 4 extra times drastically increases the chance of a microscopic error. The yield rates, the percentage of chips on a wafer that actually work, they just plummet.
So you're throwing away most of the silicon.
Exactly. The cost per functional chip skyrockets. If SMIC were a purely commercial enterprise answering to regular shareholders, they would go bankrupt attempting this.
But they aren't answering to shareholders. They are the technological vanguard of a nation-state determined to achieve AI parity.
Right. When you are cut off from the best tools, you don't care about profit margins or yield rates. You only care about the final capability.
If it costs you 10 times as much to produce an AI chip using an inefficient workaround, you just absorb the cost. And that relentless push is yielding results, right?
It is. Reuters reported that a team of former ASML engineers in Shenzhen allegedly completed a prototype EUV machine in 2025, and Beijing has set a mandate to produce functional chips from it by 2028.
Wait, 2028, that's right around the corner. Is that realistic?
Well, that 2028 deadline is where the engineering community remains highly skeptical. Replicating the physical blueprint of an EUV machine is one thing. Mastering the applied physics is another universe entirely.
Because it's not just a blueprint, it's like controlling a tiny star,
Right,
right?
basically, yeah. You have to fire high-powered lasers at microscopic droplets of molten tin in a complete vacuum, thousands of times a second, just to generate the specific wavelength of light.
That is mind-boggling.
Most serious analysts believe China is still a decade away from a commercially viable, homegrown EUV machine. But Washington isn't willing to take that bet. They look at the multi-patterning success with the older machines and realize their current containment strategy is leaking.
Which brings us to the legislative hammer that the U.S. is swinging, the MPCH Act.
Oh yeah, the MTCH Act.
Introduced with bipartisan support in April 2026, this piece of legislation represents a massive escalation. It doesn't just look forward, it looks backward.
How so?
The MACCH Act demands that ASML cease all servicing, spare parts delivery, and software updates for the hundreds of older DUV machines already legally operating inside China.
Wow, so it is a retroactive strangulation of China's existing tech infrastructure.
Exactly. Without constant maintenance and proprietary spare parts from the Dutch engineers, those DUV machines will inevitably degrade and fail. But the MATCH Act doesn't just target China, it places a metaphorical gun to the head of European allies.
Right. It gives the Dutch government 150 days to perfectly align their national export controls with these new, ultra-strict American standards.
And if The Hague refuses, what's the penalty?
Then the U.S. threatens to invoke the Foreign Direct Product Rule.
Okay, let's linger on that rule for a second because it is the ultimate trump card of American geopolitical leverage.
It really is the biggest stick they have.
The Foreign Direct Product Rule allows the U.S. to enforce its laws extraterritorially. Washington is effectively telling the Dutch government, we don't care that ASML is a European company. Because your machines rely on a tiny percentage of components, patents, or software that originated in the United States, we claim legal jurisdiction over who you can sell the final product to.
Which is an incredible flex of soft power turned hard power.
It is. If ASML defies the rule, the U.S. can instantly cut them off from the global financial system and block them from buying any American-made parts. It's a corporate death sentence.
And you can see exactly why the Dutch are furious about this. Sjoerdsma, the Dutch trade minister, is violently pushing back against this overreach. And he's highlighting a pretty breathtaking hypocrisy in the American position.
The NVIDIA chip thing, yes.
While the U.S. is threatening to decimate Dutch tech revenues to prevent China from making their own chips, the Trump administration simultaneously approved the export of NVIDIA's highly advanced H200 AI chips directly to China.
I read that in the sources, and I honestly couldn't believe the audacity. I mean, the H200 chips can only be manufactured using the exact same EUV lithography machines that Washington is so desperate to keep out of Beijing's hands.
Exactly. The American message to Europe is essentially, you are forbidden from selling them the factory equipment because it's a profound national security threat, but we will happily sell them the finished, highly advanced AI products that come out of those exact factories because it benefits our corporate bottom line.
It's totally hypocritical, and it fractures the trust required to maintain a unified Western front. I mean, the Dutch fundamentally believe that as a sovereign nation, they should be the ones dictating their own security risks and economic policies.
To try and bypass this exact kind of friction, the sources note the U.S. is trying to formalize a new bloc called Pax Silica, the peace of silicon.
Pax Silica, catchy.
Yes, an alliance of 24 nations aimed at unifying export controls across the entire AI supply chain, so Washington doesn't have to keep using the blunt instrument of extraterritoriality to force compliance.
But the illusion that you can just ring-fence the global supply chain without severe blowback is totally shattering right now. China is actively retaliating.
Oh, they aren't just taking this lying down.
No, they have authorized massive penalties against foreign companies complying with the MATCH Act, and they've strategically blocked exports from Nexperia.
Which is a Chinese-owned chip maker, but based in the Netherlands, right?
Exactly. And that specific block sent absolute shockwaves through European and Japanese car makers who rely on those legacy chips. So the NTCH Act proves that relying on a highly globalized supply chain means your domestic economy is permanently held hostage to someone else's foreign policy.
Precisely. If you are a nation watching Washington threaten Amsterdam over chips destined for Beijing, the terrifying realization sets in that sovereignty in the 21st century requires localized silicon. You just have to build it at home, regardless of the cost.
And that realization is driving nations to make these desperate, almost illogical geographic gambles. Which takes us perfectly from the political battlefields of Europe directly to the snowy mountains of northern Japan.
Ah, yes. The Hokkaido pivot.
Right. We are looking at a completely audacious pivot to build what they are calling Hokkaido Valley.
Rapidus is the centerpiece of this whole vision. It's a government-backed consortium that launched in 2022, aggressively funded by Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai to the tune of $15 billion.
$15 billion? That is not a small bet.
Not at all. Their mandate is to catapult Japan back to the absolute frontier of semiconductor manufacturing by building a 2-nanometer fabrication plant in Chitose.
Which is a quiet suburb of Sapporo up in Hokkaido. Yeah. I look at the map and I have to challenge the logic of this location. Here's where it gets really interesting, but also a bit crazy in my opinion.
Okay, let's hear it.
Japan already has a deeply entrenched, highly successful semiconductor ecosystem in the south on the island of Kyushu.
True.
TSMC, the Taiwanese giant, has already built 2 massive fabs down there. The local government literally markets Kyushu as Silicon Island. The supplier networks exist, the specialized chemical transport routes exist.
The infrastructure is all there.
Exactly. And yet, the Japanese government and Rapidus completely bypass Silicon Island to parachute this hyper-delicate, ultra-advanced industry into a snowy wilderness. Hokkaido is famous for dairy farming, volcanoes, and the indigenous Ainu people. Can you really parachute a high-tech ecosystem into a snowy tundra? Why abandon the established hub?
It does seem totally counterintuitive until you look at the macro geopolitical map. The decision to abandon Kyushu for Hokkaido is driven almost entirely by the unspoken elephant in the region, which is Taiwan.
Ah, proximity to Taiwan.
Right. Kyushu is geographically very close to the Taiwan Strait and the East China Sea. If a kinetic conflict were to break out over Taiwan, the airspace and shipping lanes around Kyushu would be instantly compromised.
The production facilities would literally be sitting in the crosshairs of a regional war.
Exactly. Hokkaido, being located in the far north, provides vital, desperately needed geographic diversification. It is a pure safety play.
Okay, the geographic distance from a potential war zone makes total sense. But a 2-nanometer fab is a resource glutton. Does Hokkaido actually have the physical infrastructure to support it?
Surprisingly, yes. And in some ways, it's actually better equipped than the South. Fabs require an astronomical amount of ultra-pure water to wash the silicon wafers between all the hundreds of chemical treatments.
Sure.
Hokkaido has water in absolute abundance.
What about power?
Even more critically, the island offers a massive, stable energy profile. The local governor recently approved the restart of the island's sole nuclear power plant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which guarantees a steady, carbon-free baseload for the grid.
And the sources mention the renewable potential is staggering, too. Hokkaido is projected to generate a full 33% of Japan's total offshore wind power by 2040.
So you combine that massive, cheap green energy with the naturally freezing climate, which drastically lowers the cooling costs for the massive data centers required to process AI. And the physical foundations of Hokkaido Valley start to look incredibly strategic.
Right. SoftBank is already capitalizing on this, building a $400 million data center just down the road in Tomakomai.
The physical resources are definitely there, but the fatal flaw in the Rapidus master plan isn't water or electricity. It's the human element.
The talent pool.
Yeah. The demographic and educational realities of northern Japan are actively working against them. You are trying to build an ecosystem that requires thousands of the most specialized, highly trained engineers on the planet.
But doesn't Hokkaido have a good university?
Hokkaido University is an excellent institution, but it was historically founded to support the local economy. Its legacy is in agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. They are only just now attempting to pivot their curriculum to train quantum physicists and lithography experts.
So they're facing a massive domestic talent drought. And the proposed solution of importing foreign talent seems deeply flawed.
Why is that?
Well, Rapidus is pitching Hokkaido as this cool lifestyle destination, right? Like, come work on bleeding-edge chips, then go ski world-class powder on the weekends.
Sounds nice in theory.
Sure, but if you are a top-tier engineer in Silicon Valley or Hsinchu, Taiwan, why would you uproot your family to move to a place with bitterly cold, dark winters, virtually no international schools for your children, and salaries that historically lag far behind the global standard?
You wouldn't, which is why Rapidus is currently relying almost entirely on a skeleton crew of veteran Japanese engineers who cut their teeth back in the 1980s and are nearing retirement.
That is not a sustainable workforce.
And the lack of human capital extends to the corporate supply chain, too. A fab cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires hundreds of highly specialized support companies, chemical vendors, precision tool manufacturers, advanced packaging facilities.
And none of that is in Hokkaido currently.
Currently, manufacturing makes up less than 10% of Hokkaido's economic output. The supplier ecosystem is functionally zero. It will take a decade to build it out.
So it creates this brutal chicken and egg scenario. The vital suppliers refuse to invest billions to build local facilities until Rapidus proves it can actually manufacture a 2-nanometer chip at scale. But Rapidus struggles to hit those production milestones without local suppliers right down the road.
Exactly. The industry consensus is that it takes a minimum of 10 years of sustained, flawless execution to cultivate a cluster of this magnitude.
So how are they trying to survive that decade?
To survive that decade in the wilderness, Rapidus is deploying a highly unorthodox business model. They are fundamentally rejecting the strategy that made TSMC a behemoth.
How so?
TSMC wins through sheer scale and ruthless standardization. They pump out millions of identical chips. Rapidus is aiming for the exact opposite. Their strategy is to offer extremely fast turnaround times for small batches of bespoke, custom-designed AI chips.
Which perfectly caters to the current AI panic, right? Where every major tech firm wants proprietary silicon optimized for their specific algorithmic architecture.
Exactly. If Rapidus can actually deliver small batch, custom 2-nanometer chips faster than TSMC, the gamble pays off big time.
Yeah.
The Japanese government projects it could inject an astonishing 11.2 trillion yen into Hokkaido's GDP between 2023 and 2036.
11.2 trillion yen. But if the yield rates fail, if the suppliers don't show up, if the engineers don't move, Tokyo will have essentially incinerated $15 billion in the snow.
It's a massive risk.
Yeah.
But, you can't talk about localized silicon sovereignty without talking about where the actual megawatts come from to run those fabs and data centers.
Right, power is everything.
Japan has the luxury of nuclear restarts and offshore wind. But the rest of Southeast Asia, which the International Energy Agency predicts will account for a full 20% of the total global increase in power demand by 2035, is desperately hunting for baseload electricity.
Yeah, if you want to train the AI, you need the bespoke chips. But before you power on the chips, you need an ocean of electricity. And with traditional energy markets thoroughly destabilized right now, the region is looking inward.
Which takes us from the snowy peaks of Japan down to the incredibly turbulent, muddy waters of the Mekong River.
Right. We need to talk about Laos. And honestly, it's a tragic situation.
Laos is a masterclass in the unintended consequences of infrastructure ambition. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a small, landlocked country of roughly 8 million people. The per capita income sits at a very modest $2,400.
Yet the government in Vientiane has embraced this incredibly audacious national identity. They intend to be the permanent battery of Southeast Asia.
And they do have the geography to support the claim. The Mekong River and its massive tributaries violently cut through the mountainous terrain of Laos. The kinetic energy potential of that falling water is just staggering.
And they realized this early on, right?
They did. They recognized this early beginning power exports to Thailand back in 1971. But the current scale of development is really difficult to comprehend.
What are the numbers looking like?
They currently have 80 hydroelectric plants in operation, generating 12 gigawatts of capacity.
Yeah.
For context, that is enough electricity to completely power the entire nation of Singapore at peak demand.
And they aren't stopping there. The stated goal in the sources is to reach 100 operational dams and 15 gigawatts of capacity by 2030. Electricity has rapidly become the lifeblood of the Laotian economy.
Yeah, in 2024 alone, power exports brought in $2.4 billion, accounting for a full quarter of all national exports. They're selling power to 6 different neighboring countries, transmitting electrons as far as 2,000 kilometers away to Singapore.
So on paper, this reads like a triumph of geographic utilization, a developing nation harnessing clean, renewable energy to enrich its populace and stabilize the regional grid. But when I look at the financial data in these sources, it looks less like an economic miracle and more like a textbook debt trap.
It absolutely is. The financing for these 80 dams isn't coming from domestic savings. It's overwhelmingly foreign debt, and specifically Chinese debt.
The scale of the leverage is terrifying. The public debt of Laos is projected to hit an unsustainable 81% of its total GDP by 2025. And roughly half of that massive debt burden is owed directly to Chinese state banks and enterprises.
Which is by design, in many ways. China and Laos share a border, and they share the political affinity of being nominally communist one-party states. Beijing has flooded Laos with infrastructure capital, not just dams, but high-speed railways and rare earth mining operations.
I struggle to see the long-term endgame here for Vientiane. Like, are we looking at intentional neocolonialism by Beijing, deliberately extending loans they know cannot be repaid to seize sovereign assets? Or is this just catastrophic macroeconomic underwriting by both parties?
It's likely a mix of strategic opportunism by Beijing and sheer desperation for growth by Vientiane. You have to look at the specific mechanics of these deals to understand it.
Wait, break that down for me.
Most of the Chinese finance dams operate on a build, operate, transfer, or BOT model.
Build, operate, transfer.
Right. A Chinese state-owned enterprise provides the capital, they physically construct the dam, and then they own and operate the facility, taking the lion's share of the revenue for decades to recoup their investment.
So the asset sits in Laotian territory, using Laotian water, but the profits flow back to Shenzhen or Beijing.
Exactly. The Lowy Institute estimates that the absolute earliest the Laotian government can expect to assume actual operational control and full revenue of these major projects is 2035. Meanwhile, the sovereign debt incurred to facilitate these projects remains on the national balance sheet, completely crushing their credit rating.
And the debt pressure has already forced catastrophic concessions. The sources detail how Électricité du Laos, or EDL, the state-owned national utility, was bleeding so much cash that in 2021, they surrendered a 90% ownership stake in their own national transmission grid.
That is just wild to me.
They literally handed control of the physical wires that carry power across their country to a subsidiary of China's Southern Power Grid for a 25-year concession. It's like taking out a massive mortgage to build a commercial bakery in your house, but your own kids are going hungry. You graduate from a developing nation to a modern state by building infrastructure. You don't surrender the keys to a foreign superpower just to make the interest payments.
It is a profound loss of sovereignty. But the tragedy of Laos isn't just financial. It's deeply ecological.
Right, the river itself.
The Mekong River isn't just a conduit for water. It is one of the most vital biodiverse aquatic ecosystems on the planet. Environmental groups have meticulously documented how the construction of these 80 massive concrete barriers has devastated the river's natural flow.
Because it blocks everything.
Exactly. They're blocking the sediment necessary for agriculture downstream and causing the total collapse of migratory fish stocks. Riverbank erosion is rampant. Millions of people in the region rely entirely on that river for their daily protein, and the dams are starving them out.
The irony is brutal. I keep thinking of the Laotian citizen living in the shadow of one of these Chinese-owned dams. The government is exporting billions of dollars of electricity to the glittering skylines of Singapore and Bangkok. Yet, domestically, the grid is a shambles.
Oh, completely.
EDL operates at a massive loss because the local transmission lines are so degraded they literally leak power. And because hydropower is entirely dependent on weather during the dry season when the river levels plummet, the dams can't spin the turbines.
Which leads to the ultimate economic paradox.
Yeah.
During those dry months, Laos, the self-proclaimed battery of the region, suffers crippling domestic blackouts.
Unbelievable.
And they're forced to import electricity back from Thailand at emergency premium rates that far exceed what they charge for their own exports. To attempt to plug this gap, they recently unveiled a massive 1-gigawatt solar plant in the north, the largest in Southeast Asia.
Let me guess. The solar plant was also financed and built by a Chinese state firm.
Precisely. And primarily designed to export power back into the Chinese grid. The entire national strategy has crowded out any meaningful domestic social spending. Every available dollar goes to servicing foreign debt or building more export capacity.
So the health clinics and school are just starved of funding.
Exactly. And as a direct result, Laotian citizens are actively fleeing across the border into Thailand to seek basic, livable wages.
The sources mention that this November, the United Nations is officially graduating Laos from its list of least developed countries. But looking at the reality on the ground, a hollowed-out social safety net, a collapsing river ecosystem, and a national grid owned by Beijing, that graduation feels like a cruel bureaucratic technicality rather than a genuine economic triumph.
It perfectly illustrates how economic leverage operates in the modern era. China doesn't need to station troops in Vientiane to dictate Laotian policy. They control the balance sheets and the high-voltage transmission lines. The leverage is quiet, pervasive, and legally binding.
But we shouldn't confuse that quiet economic coercion with an abandonment of loud, kinetic military power, right?
Not at all.
While China uses debt to bind its southern neighbors, it is using sheer ballistic force to intimidate its eastern rivals. The sources pivot to a stark demonstration of hard power that fundamentally alters the security calculus of the Pacific. Let's look at the events of July 6th.
So on July 6th, the Chinese military announced a highly unusual, very public test. One of their nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, which are referred to in naval parlance as a boomer, launched an intercontinental ballistic missile carrying a dummy warhead directly into the international waters of the Pacific Ocean.
Now, a nation test firing a missile isn't inherently shocking on its own, but the sources highlight that this specific test sent immediate panic through regional capitals. I want to drill down into why a submarine launch in the open Pacific is treated so differently than, say, a test from a land-based silo in the Gobi Desert.
It changes the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence. To understand the panic, you have to look at how the U.S. Navy tracks these threats.
Okay, how does that work?
Boomers are the ultimate trump card of the nuclear triad. Their sole strategic purpose is survivability. They are designed to vanish under the thermal layers of the deep ocean, becoming acoustically invisible, ready to unleash a retaliatory strike even if their home nation is totally wiped out.
Right, a second strike capability.
Exactly. Up until recently, the U.S. Navy enjoyed a distinct acoustic advantage. Older Chinese submarines were notoriously loud and relatively easy for American attack subs and sonar nets to track.
But this test signals that the Chinese Navy believes their boomers are now quiet enough and reliable enough to operate effectively far beyond their heavily defended coastal bastions. What kind of payload are we talking about here?
Military analysts believe the missile was either a JL-2 or the highly advanced JL-3, and the distinction there is critical.
Why is that?
The older JL-2 has a maximum range of roughly 7 to 200 kilometers. To strike the continental United States with a JL-2, a Chinese submarine would have to successfully navigate past the first island chain, past Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and expose itself in the deep waters of the mid-Pacific.
Which is basically a gauntlet of U.S. Navy acoustic sensors and attack subs.
Exactly. But the JL-3 changes the math entirely. It boasts an estimated range of 10,000 kilometers. With the JL-3, a Chinese boomer doesn't need to run the gauntlet. It can stay submerged within the heavily fortified, easily defensible waters of the South China Sea or the Bohai Sea and still possess the range to hit the American mainland.
Wow. So the July 6th test was a very public declaration that the era of uncontested American acoustic dominance in the Pacific is over.
Yes.
And the timing of this demonstration is deeply cynical. It occurred just days before a major NATO summit and directly coincided with large-scale American-led naval exercises near Hawaii. It was a calculated middle finger to Western naval hegemony. And it is happening against a backdrop of complete diplomatic silence, which is terrifying.
That is the most alarming data point in the text, honestly. The Pentagon projects that China is undertaking a breathtaking expansion of its nuclear arsenal, scaling from the low 600s in 2024 to potentially over 1,000 operational warheads by 2030.
And no one is talking about it.
Well, in the past, this kind of rapid escalation was managed through back-channel diplomacy and arms control treaties. But in 2024, Beijing unilaterally suspended all nuclear arms control talks with the United States in retaliation for American weapon sales to Taiwan.
So we have a rapidly expanding arsenal, new platforms that evade acoustic tracking, and absolutely zero diplomatic guardrails to manage a misunderstanding. You can completely see why the Australian foreign minister flatly labeled the test as destabilizing.
Absolutely.
But here is where the sources draw a brilliant contrast. While the People's Liberation Army projects the threat of nuclear annihilation in the Pacific, the Chinese state media apparatus is deploying a completely different, almost theatrical form of soft power to project superiority.
Well, this part is fascinating.
They are systematically mocking the political instability of Western democracies and using the United Kingdom as their primary target.
The fodder for this media campaign is the recent resignation of Keir Starmer. His departure marks an astonishing statistic. The UK has churned through 6 different prime ministers in a single decade.
6 in 10 years. If you are an editor at the People's Daily in Beijing, tasked with convincing 1.4 billion people that the chaotic, messy process of democratic elections is a failed experiment, the chaos in Westminster is an absolute gift.
It allows the Chinese Communist Party to validate its own authoritarian rigidity by contrasting it with Western dysfunction. The state media heavily amplified interviews with diplomats like Cui Hongjian, who perfectly articulated the party line.
What was his argument?
He argued that the fundamental flaw of liberal democracy is that political parties are pathologically obsessed with short-term electoral victories. Because they are slaves to the polling data, they simply swap out the person at the top to appease the mob, rather than executing the deeply unpopular multi-decade policies required to actually fix systemic economic rot.
The subtext they are broadcasting to their citizens is deafeningly clear. It's like, look at the humiliating revolving door in London. Be grateful you live under a system that doesn't waste time on the theater of elections. We offer permanence and long-term planning. But the sources reveal that the Chinese populace is not just passively absorbing this propaganda, they are actively subverting it. And they are doing it using a 40-year-old British sitcom.
Yes. The Yes Minister phenomenon is one of the most fascinating cultural insights in the text.
Explain this to me because I found it amazing.
So, Yes Minister is a brilliantly cynical 1980s BBC comedy centered on a well-meaning but utterly incompetent British politician who is constantly manipulated by his elite, highly entrenched civil servants. Suddenly, this vintage show is exploding on the Chinese internet.
It's going viral.
A single analysis video on Bilibili, which is the Chinese equivalent of YouTube, garnered over 9 million views. The show even has elite endorsement. The wife of the late former Premier Li Keqiang published a Chinese translation of a book based on the series.
I found this utterly captivating. Why does a dry, verbose comedy about 1980s Whitehall bureaucracy resonate so profoundly with Gen Z and millennial Chinese netizens today?
This raises an important question, right? It functions as a perfectly safe, coded mirror. When a young person in Shanghai watches the manipulative, unaccountable bureaucrats in Yes Minister effortlessly stifle any attempt at reform, they immediately recognize their own reality.
Ah, so they're seeing the reflection of the vast, impenetrable, often absurd bureaucracy of the Chinese state.
Exactly.
Yep.
It operates as a psychological pressure valve.
The sources highlight a specific quote from the show that is going viral on Weibo. The naive politician says, "Surely the citizens of a democracy have a right to know." And his cynical bureaucratic handler deadpans, "No, they have a right to be ignorant."
It's so dark.
You can entirely understand why someone living behind the Great Firewall, subjected to intense internet censorship, would find that exchange darkly, painfully hilarious. By laughing at fictional British bureaucrats, they can collectively vent their frustration with their own officials without crossing the red lines of directly criticizing the Communist Party.
But the sources note that the commentary goes far beyond just mocking the bureaucracy. The netizens are actively turning the state media's narrative about Keir Starmer completely upside down.
So.
While the People's Daily presents the rapid turnover of British prime ministers as a symptom of fatal democratic decay, the comments section on Chinese social media reveals a profound, closely guarded envy.
They are looking at the chaos in London and desiring it.
They are expressing envy for the mechanism of replacement itself. The contrast with their domestic reality is stark. Xi Jinping ascended to power in 2012, and in 2018 he orchestrated the constitutional removal of presidential term limits. His rule is, for all intents and purposes, unending.
So the capability to peacefully remove a leader who is failing, even if the process is messy and chaotic, is a luxury the Chinese populace does not possess.
Right. And to express a desire for leadership replacement in Xi Jinping's China is an act of incredible digital bravery. The sources quote a user responding to someone pointing out this envy, simply saying, "Wow, you dare to say it."
It perfectly encapsulates the claustrophobia of the system. And amidst this grand clash of ideologies, the sources provide one brief, chilling detail that shows how individual human lives are casually traded as chips in this geopolitical casino. Let's discuss the release of Ezra Jin.
Yeah, Jin Mingri, known in the West as Ezra Jin, was a towering figure in China's underground religious community. He pastored Zion Church in Beijing, which was one of the largest unregistered house churches in the country.
And he got swept up in a crackdown, right?
When authorities physically shuttered the building in 2018, during a broader crackdown on religious freedom, he adapted. He moved his massive congregation online, but eventually the state apparatus caught up with him, and he was detained.
A prominent dissident, jailed by an authoritarian state. It's a tragically common story. But then abruptly, he is released and placed on a flight to the United States. I look at this and I have to ask, did the Chinese legal apparatus suddenly develop a conscience? Did they review his case and find him innocent of subversion?
Yes. Not at all. Ezra Jin's release was a clinical exercise in geopolitical leverage. The sources revealed the backstory. Donald Trump, during a high-stakes bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping in May 2026, directly raised Jin's specific case.
Okay.
Trump also pushed for the release of Jimmy Lai, the imprisoned pro-democracy billionaire in Hong Kong. Xi reportedly dismissed Lai as a tough one, meaning Lai's continued imprisonment was a non-negotiable core interest of the state. But Ezra Jin, he was reclassified from a prisoner to a tradable asset.
By releasing the pastor to the Americans, Xi Jinping secures a low-cost diplomatic victory. He grants a highly visible favor to the U.S. president, generates a positive headline, and gives up absolutely nothing of strategic or military value. It is the cold, calculated reality of how human rights are weaponized and traded in great power competition.
Which is an incredibly heavy realization to carry. We have spent the entire first half of this deep dive into the sources analyzing the macro pressures crushing down on the global system. We've dissected the technological chokeholds of ASML, the multi-billion-dollar geographic gambles in Hokkaido, the debt traps strangling the Mekong River, the acoustic signatures of nuclear submarines.
It's a lot. The sheer scale of these maneuvers is exhausting.
It really is.
It begs the question, If the macro reality is this intense, this unforgiving, what is happening at the micro level, how does the average citizen living underneath this crushing architecture of geopolitical ambition actually cope with the daily stress?
That's the real question.
To find the answer, the sources pivot away from government strategy and into the deeply human search for meaning. We are going to start with a truly bizarre, highly modern spectacle unfolding in South Korea.
Oh, we need to talk about the phenomenon of Gabi.
Gabi, the humanoid robot monk. If you want a visual that perfectly encapsulates the collision of ancient tradition and futuristic anxiety, this is it.
Picture the Korean Buddhism Culture Expo in Daegu. It is a traditional gathering space for religious elders and monastic orders, and rolling across the exhibition floor, dressed in immaculate traditional robes, is a robot chanting sutras.
Desperately trying to generate algorithmic buzz for an ancient philosophy. And the wildest part is, it's working. Young Koreans are swarming these expos. They are buying out merchandise booths, selling t-shirts with slogans like, "Shut up and meditate."
It's totally wild. An expo in Seoul recorded a staggering 250,000 visitors, overwhelmingly comprised of Generation Z and millennials.
Why? Why is a demographic so fundamentally tied to the hyper-digital, hyper-competitive modern world suddenly flocking to Buddhism?
Because the hyper-competitive modern world they were promised has completely failed them. To understand the appeal of Buddhism to Korean youth, you have to look at the brutal economic data. The sources highlight a terrifying statistic.
Let's hear it.
The number of young adults in South Korea who are classified as economically inactive has nearly tripled since 2004.
I want to clarify what economically inactive actually means, because it's not just a polite term for unemployment. These are young people who are not working, they are not actively looking for work, and they are not enrolled in higher education. They have essentially opted out or been forced out of the economic system entirely.
Yeah, they're just done.
And looking at the structure of the South Korean economy, I don't think you can write this off as a generational lack of ambition. The societal pressure cooker is completely unique. The entire economic model revolves around the cables, the massive family-run conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai.
The Kabul system demands absolute perfection from a very young age. The competition for the incredibly limited slots at top-tier universities, which are the only gateway to a secure job at a Kabul, is soul-crushing.
The societal narrative is singular. If you do not secure one of these specific high-status positions, your life is deemed a failure. The traditional milestones of adulthood, owning a home, getting married, having children, are financially unattainable for the vast majority.
The stress is producing unprecedented levels of clinical depression. They are a generation that played by the rules, studied until midnight every night, and arrived at the finish line to find the doors locked.
And when the prosperity gospel of relentless studying completely collapses, you need a new philosophy to survive the disappointment. This is where Buddhism offers a profoundly counterintuitive comfort. It does not promise that if you pray hard enough, you will get the job at Samsung.
It promises the exact opposite. The foundational tenet of Buddhism, the first noble truth, is the absolute acceptance that life is inherently suffering.
Wow.
It acknowledges that pain, dissatisfaction, and extreme stress are not bugs in the system of life. They are the baseline reality. For a young Korean who has been relentlessly told that their unhappiness is a result of their own personal failure to work hard enough, hearing an ancient, respected religion state, "No, existence is just inherently stressful," is incredibly validating.
It strips away the crushing burden of personal guilt. I also find the mechanics of the religion appealing to this specific demographic. The sources point out that Buddhism fundamentally relies on faith in oneself, rather than submission to an external, omnipotent deity.
It is a philosophy of extreme self-reliance. You aren't begging a god to fix your bank account. You are utilizing the technology of mindfulness to manage your own neurological reaction to a chaotic, unfair world.
It is deeply pragmatic. Books translating ancient texts into modern vernacular with titles like Life Hacks from the Buddha are dominating bestseller lists. Historic mountain temples are fully booked with young professionals seeking weekend retreats simply to disconnect their smartphones and sit in silence.
But this massive influx of hipster spirituality is triggering a fierce existential debate within the monastic hierarchy.
Which is fascinating because prior to this robot-driven boom, traditional institutional Buddhism in South Korea was facing demographic collapse, right?
Absolutely. Overall, religious affiliation in South Korea has been steadily plummeting. More critically for the institution, the pipeline of actual monks is drying up. Ordinations within the Jogi order, which is the dominant sect of Korean Buddhism, have collapsed to less than a third of their levels from 2 decades ago.
So the institution is desperate for relevance and new blood.
Right, so the elders are caught in a trap. They are thrilled that 250,000 kids are showing up to their expos, but they are deeply anxious about how the religion is being consumed. You have historic temples suddenly pivoting to host electronic dance music parties and singles matchmaking events in the courtyards.
It forces a philosophical split. On one side, you have progressives like the Venerable Sirwan, a monk from one of the oldest temples, who enthusiastically defends the unorthodox approach. She argues that the core strength of Buddhism over millennia has been its ability to adapt its presentation to fit the cultural vernacular of the time.
If a robot monk or a techno beat gets a stressed teenager to contemplate their existence, it's a valid entry point.
But on the other side, traditionalists like the Venerable Ilhawa view this with deep alarm. They argue that the religion is being aggressively cherry-picked and stripped of its rigorous intellectual and moral core.
Right. Shut up and meditate is a fantastic slogan for a coffee mug, but does it actually lead to nirvana? The traditionalists fear that the profound, difficult work of achieving enlightenment is being diluted into a shallow, consumer-friendly aesthetic of wellness.
You see startups like the Hadel company mass-producing plastic keychains with Buddhist memes. The founder of that company explicitly stated, "I have always found Buddhism incredibly fun and cool."
When a 2,500-year-old discipline of asceticism is rebranded as fun and cool, something fundamental is arguably lost.
Hmm.
But the sources conclude with a pragmatic observation. These plastic knickknacks and robot monks might not lead to genuine enlightenment, but they are acting as a vital emotional tourniquet.
They are keeping a highly stressed, marginalized demographic from completely despairing. They are finding a middle way to survive the crushing weight of the modern South Korean economy. So, the search for meaning shapes itself to the specific pressures of the environment. In South Korea, the pressure is economic stagnation, so the response is the inward retreat of mindfulness. But if we travel to India, the environment is entirely different.
Oh, completely.
India is experiencing explosive, chaotic growth. And in that environment, the search for meaning takes a highly textual, fiercely aspirational form. We need to analyze the ecosystem of the traffic light books.
It is one of the most vivid observations in the text. In the massive, gridlocked intersections of cities like Mumbai and Delhi, as cars sit idling in the heat and exhaust fumes, hawkers weave through the traffic, tapping on windows to sell stacks of pirated books.
That single image tells you so much about the macroeconomic reality of India. It tells you there is a ferocious, insatiable domestic hunger for reading material. It tells you that formal physical bookstores are largely inaccessible to the masses. And it tells you that the enforcement of intellectual property law is, let's say, highly flexible.
Very flexible.
But the detail that truly unlocks the psychology of the Indian consumer is the language printed on those pirated pages.
Every single book being peddled at those traffic lights is in English. India is a nation of over 1.4 billion people, with dozens of official languages, yet only a minuscule fraction of the population speaks English as their first language.
Despite that, the street-level black market, as well as the legitimate top 100 bestseller list on Amazon India, is overwhelmingly dominated by English texts. I look at that data and I have to ask, why the absolute monopoly of English?
So what does this all mean? The source makes a critical distinction. In the Indian context, English is rarely consumed as a language of pure leisure or literary escapism. English is the ultimate language of aspiration.
It is the mandatory operating system for corporate success, upward socioeconomic mobility, and integration into the global economy.
Reading in English is a deliberate act of self-investment, and the genre data completely reinforces this. In mature Western publishing markets, fiction is the undisputed king. In India, a staggering 50% of all books sold are nonfiction.
They aren't buying stories, they are buying instruction manuals.
Exactly.
The genre of self-improvement has established an absolute hegemony over the Indian reading public. The global titans of the genre, books like James Clear's Atomic Habits or Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money, are permanent fixtures on the bestseller lists. But what I find truly fascinating is the evolution of the market. Indian readers are no longer just importing Western hustle culture, they are demanding a highly localized, homegrown version of self-optimization.
Right. For decades, the market was dominated by American imports like Dale Carnegie. But today, the most influential voices are Indian content creators who understand the specific cultural topography. The sources highlight an entrepreneur named Ankur Warikoo. In 2021, he published a book with the rather subtle title, Do epic shit.
A title that perfectly captures the subtle nuance of internet hustle culture.
Oh, absolutely. But you cannot argue with the metrics. It has sold well over 300,000 copies. The genius of Wariku's approach is that he takes the universal Silicon Valley concepts of productivity, risk-taking, and wealth generation and maps them directly onto the deeply specific anxieties of the Indian middle class.
So what kind of anxieties?
He addresses how to hustle while navigating suffocating familial expectations, immense societal pressure to conform, and the fierce competition of a billion-person labor market.
Wow, that is highly specific, but the aspiration isn't limited to just maximizing your stock portfolio or optimizing your morning routine, right? The ambition is also intellectual.
Yes, the sources document a massive surge in books focused on self-discovery through dense historical analysis. Indian readers are devouring massive scholarly tomes by domestic authors like Manu Pillai and Soumya Ashok.
They are aggressively reclaiming their own historical narrative, seeking to understand the incredibly complex tapestry of the subcontinent through the lens of Indian historians, rather than relying on the biased colonial-era texts offered by the British.
It is a massive intellectual reclamation project. And perhaps the most uniquely Indian phenomenon in the book market is the seamless fusion of ancient spirituality with cutthroat corporate ambition.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Religion remains a massive defining force in Indian daily life, but the publishing industry has brilliantly repackaged it for the LinkedIn generation. You have figures like Gaurav Gopal Das, who actively brands himself as an urban online monk.
An urban online monk.
Yeah, he takes ancient spiritual principles and converts them into actionable, bullet-pointed life hacks for stressed professionals. And this fusion reaches the absolute highest echelons of power.
Right. The sources note that India's current foreign minister published a best-selling book analyzing modern geopolitics through the strategic lessons embedded in the ancient epic, the Ramayana. Other publishers explicitly market translations of the Mahabharata directly to CEOs, promising hidden leadership strategies for hostile corporate takeovers.
It is a complete, unironic blending of the sacred and the boardroom. When you synthesize all these trends, the English language aspiration, the hyper-localized hustle culture, the historical reclamation, and the corporate spiritualism, the sources arrive at a profound psychological conclusion about what the physical act of reading represents in modern India.
Culturally and historically, India operates as a deeply collectivist society, right? Your fundamental identity is rarely viewed in isolation. It is deeply, inextricably bound to your family unit, your caste, your religion, and your local community.
Right. You are fundamentally a component of a larger structure, not an independent atom. The pressure to conform to the expectations of the collective is immense.
But the act of reading is, by its very nature, a solitary endeavor. When you open a book, you block out the collective. You engage in an intimate, strictly private dialogue with the author's mind.
The analysis suggests that the voracious consumption of these specific aspirational books is serving a dual purpose. Yes, they want the knowledge, but more importantly, the act of reading has become a socially acceptable, respectable mechanism for carving out an individual identity in a collectivist culture.
Whether a young professional is reading Atomic Habits to escape their current socioeconomic bracket, or ostentatiously holding a copy of Dostoevsky on the metro to project a sophisticated persona, the ultimate objective is self-expression.
It is a quiet, highly profitable rebellion of the individual.
It is a beautiful insight into the domestic ambition of the Indian citizen. You see the hunger for progress in the eyes of the traffic light hawkers. You see it in the sales data of the translated epics. But, and this is where the narrative takes a very dark, very necessary turn, what happens when that fierce individual domestic ambition collides with the unforgiving bureaucratic reality of global execution?
It gets ugly.
How does a nation that wants to conquer the world fundamentally fail to govern its own backyard?
It creates a catastrophic systemic failure. And that brings us to the final, sobering data point in our sources, the collapse of India's agricultural and food safety execution.
The section on the Great Mango Ban reads like dark comedy, but the implications are terrifying. The source paints this incredibly vibrant, almost cinematic scene. We are in the sweltering heat of Delhi at the historic Lodi Gardens. Hundreds of people have gathered for a massive festival dedicated entirely to the mango, which is India's undisputed favorite fruit.
They have a rapper performing mango-themed tracks, people are dressed in yellow, and the crowd joyously devours 120 kilograms of the fruit. It is a pure, unadulterated celebration of domestic agricultural pride.
But while the music plays in Delhi, the geopolitical reality is crashing down in Tokyo. While the festival was happening, the government of Japan announced a total, uncompromising ban on the import of all fresh Indian mangoes.
The world's absolute largest producer of the fruit was entirely locked out of one of the world's most lucrative premium markets.
Why? Because the Indian supply chain repeatedly failed Japan's basic mandatory pest control inspections. And if it were just Japan and just mangoes, you could write it off as a diplomatic anomaly. But the scale of the global rejection is staggering.
Indian agricultural exports are facing a wall of restrictions, outright bans, and punishing secondary inspections across the globe. The United States, Southeast Asian nations, and particularly the European Union are cracking down hard. The EU alone has issued 365 specific alerts against various Indian food products in just the last 2 years.
365 alerts, that is one every other day.
The economic bleeding for Indian exporters is severe. The European Union has lost so much faith in the Indian regulatory apparatus that they are now mandating independent lab testing on between 20% and 50% of all inbound shipments of Indian chili and curry leaves. And they are forcing the Indian exporters to foot the bill for those expensive tests.
A single high-quality shipping container of processed spices can hold over $100,000 worth of product. Having that container rejected and destroyed at a port in Rotterdam because it contains banned chemicals is a fatal blow to an exporting business.
But the lost export revenue, as painful as it is, completely misses the point.
Exactly. It's one thing to lose a $100,000 shipping container of spices. It's another to poison your own people. What the sources reveal about the reality inside the Indian food supply chain is genuinely horrifying.
The failure is systemic, and it begins in the dirt of the farm and runs all the way up to the processing plants. The Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, the FSSAI, conducted a nationwide sweep of domestic food samples in 2024 and 2025.
The results were apocalyptic.
Almost 20% of the domestic samples they pulled from local markets failed basic safety tests. 1 in every 5 items was deemed unsafe for human consumption.
I look at that 20% failure rate, and I think about the parents trying to feed their kids in Mumbai. It's Russian roulette at the grocery store. The sources detail exactly why the failure rate is so high.
It starts with completely unregulated runaway pesticide use by farmers who lack even basic chemical training. They are indiscriminately spraying highly toxic, globally banned chemicals onto their crops.
Because corruption is endemic and local monitoring is virtually non-existent, these poison-soaked vegetables, often cross-contaminated with lethal microbial bugs like salmonella from untreated water travel unimpeded into the urban markets.
The article highlights a specific raid conducted by authorities in the state of Gujarat that perfectly illustrates the rot. The inspectors uncovered a massive hidden stockpile of mangoes that were completely infested with worms and covered in toxic fungus.
And those mangoes weren't going to the garbage.
No, they were actively being processed to be sold as commercial fruit juice to the domestic public.
Fungus juice for the domestic market, while the pristine fruits are sent to the ports to try and pass European inspections. And it's not just neglect, it's active, malicious adulteration. To maximize profits, middlemen routinely use artificial chemical ripeners.
These chemicals make green fruit look perfectly ripe and appealing on the shelf, but they are highly toxic. The continued consumption of these specific chemicals is linked to acute organ failure.
And that's the fast killer. The slow killer is the daily accumulation of unregulated pesticides in the bloodstream, which drastically spikes the risk of various cancers over a lifespan.
It is the ultimate paradox of the Indian growth story. The fierce ambition to scale up, to dominate global export markets is absolutely present. But the basic bureaucratic competence required to execute safety standards is failing catastrophically. The tragedy is that India has stringent, world-class food safety laws physically written on the books. The legislation exists.
But the political will to implement and enforce those laws at the ground level is completely absent. I read this and wonder if it's fixable. How do you reform a supply chain involving hundreds of millions of independent farmers and deeply entrenched, corrupt middlemen?
It is fixable, but it requires a level of political courage that India hasn't demonstrated yet. The source provides a brilliant counterexample, pointing to a neighboring country that the Indian political elite often condescendingly looks down upon.
Bangladesh.
Right. A decade ago, Bangladesh was facing a massive, silent public health disaster involving turmeric.
Turmeric is a foundational spice in South Asian cooking. What was the contamination?
Local suppliers, Desperate to make their low-quality turmeric look premium, were routinely adulterating the spice by lacing it with a chemical compound called lead chromate. It enhanced the bright, vibrant yellow color of the spice, making it visually appealing and highly profitable.
But lead chromate is a neurotoxin. It causes severe cardiovascular disease in adults, and it is uniquely, permanently devastating to the cognitive development of young children. They were literally sacrificing the IQ of the next generation for a brighter shade of yellow.
Exactly, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. But unlike India, Bangladesh actually solved the problem. Over the past decade, they have managed to virtually eliminate lead chromate adulteration from their domestic turmeric supply.
And they didn't achieve this by quietly passing a new regulation and hoping the market would correct itself, did they?
No, they achieved it through overwhelming aggressive execution. They treated it like a national security threat. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh personally intervened to prioritize the issue.
They deployed the full weight of the state.
They launched massive graphic television and radio campaigns, educating the rural public about the specific dangers of lead chromate. They physically plastered 50,000 brightly colored warning notices in every public market across the country.
And most importantly, they didn't just find the violators. They made adulteration a strict criminal offense, and they ruthlessly enforced it, sending suppliers to prison regardless of the economic disruption it caused to the spice trade.
They prioritized the execution of the law over the ambition of the profit margin. The lesson for India, and really for any nation trying to transition to superpower status, is stark. Having the ambition to be great and writing the laws to be great is entirely meaningless if you lack the operational competence and political courage to enforce those standards when it hurts. Execution is the only metric that matters.
And that reality of execution versus ambition brings us full circle.
It does.
We have covered a truly massive expanse of geopolitical and cultural territory today, analyzing the raw data from our July 2026 sources. We started by looking at the microscopic, perfectly ordered grids of 2-nanometer silicon chips and the multi-billion-dollar desperate gambles to build them in the snows of Hokkaido to escape the gravitational pull of a potential war over Taiwan.
We watched the Dutch government and ASML struggle to survive the crossfire between retroactive American export controls and fierce Chinese retaliation.
We floated down the Mekong River, analyzing how Laos surrendered its sovereign power grid to Beijing just to keep the lights on and service an unpayable debt.
We watched Chinese nuclear submarines alter the acoustic math of the Pacific, while their citizens secretly used British sitcoms to cope with the unending reality of their own bureaucracy.
And we saw the deeply poignant human response to all of this macro pressure, South Korean youth seeking emotional survival through the digitized chants of a robot monk, and Indian citizens trying to read their way to an individual identity, even while their domestic food supply chain poisons them.
When you pull all of these disparate data points together, from the chip fabs to the traffic light books, the synthesis is undeniable. We are watching Asia completely redefine its economic power, its physical infrastructure, and its cultural soul at a speed that is rewriting the rules of the 21st century.
And to you, our listener, we want to reiterate why we do these deep dives into the sources. It is so easy to view global news, semiconductor export controls, sovereign debt restructuring, the telemetry of ICBM tests, as an abstract, sterile game of geopolitical chess played by untouchable elites in distant capitals.
But if you look closely, every single piece of data we've unpacked today, from the price of a microchip to the failure rate of a mango, ultimately boils down to one fundamental truth. It is the story of humans desperately trying to secure their future and their identity in an incredibly hostile, rapidly changing world.
Whether that is a nation-state trying to secure a silicon supply chain to ensure its economic survival, or a deeply stressed student seeking a moment of inner peace via a plastic keychain, it is all driven by the exact same human anxiety.
And that leads me to a final thought, something that wasn't explicitly spelled out in the text of our sources today, but that echoes loudly through every single one of them. We are watching the greatest powers on Earth spend hundreds of billions of dollars, risk catastrophic global conflict, and upend global supply chains, all in a frantic race to build artificial intelligence that can flawlessly mimic human cognition. And yet, simultaneously, the very people building this hyper-advanced silicon-based future are increasingly retreating into 2,500-year-old philosophies, to Buddhism, to the Mahabharata, just to psychologically cope with the overwhelming stress of the present moment.
It suggests a profound imbalance.
It does. Perhaps the ultimate technology we need to master next isn't silicon-based at all. Perhaps the most critical, complex technology we desperately need to develop is human-based. How to build a society where the human mind can actually thrive alongside the machines we are sacrificing everything to create.
That is a profound thought to leave on and a perfect place to close. We've reached the end of our journey today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the narratives, keep exploring the data, and we will catch you next time.